On Christmas Day, 1831, a man named Samuel Sharpe stood before thousands of enslaved people in Jamaica and spoke words that would ignite the largest slave rebellion in British colonial history. "We will not work another day as slaves. We will demand wages for our labor. And if they refuse, we will burn every plantation from here to the sea, until they understand that we are human beings who will no longer accept chains." This is the story of how an enslaved man with no formal education became one of the most sophisticated revolutionary leaders of his time. How he organized 60,000 people across an entire region into coordinated resistance. And how his strategic brilliance and moral vision changed the course of history, even though he paid for it with his life. If you want to follow more stories of extraordinary leadership, strategic genius, and the fight for human dignity that changed the world, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Now let me take you back to Jamaica in the early 1800s, where a brilliant mind was forming in the most unlikely circumstances, preparing for a moment that would shake the foundations of an empire. Samuel Sharpe was born around 1801 in the parish of St. James, Jamaica, on a sugar plantation that was part of the vast system of Caribbean slavery that produced enormous wealth for British plantation owners while destroying the lives of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans and their descendants. From his earliest years, Samuel was marked as different, not in any way that suggested he was more valuable as property, but in ways that suggested he possessed a mind that could not be contained by the physical boundaries of slavery. He learned to read, though it was technically illegal for enslaved people to be literate, learning from a sympathetic Baptist deacon who recognized Samuel's intelligence and secretly provided him with books and instruction. By the time he was a teenager, Samuel could read the Bible fluently and had begun reading newspapers, political pamphlets, and anything else he could access, building an understanding of the world that extended far beyond the plantation where he lived. Samuel worked as a slave in the relatively privileged position of a house servant and later as a skilled worker, which gave him access to information and a degree of mobility that field workers did not have. But he never mistook his relative privilege for actual freedom, never allowed the slightly better conditions he experienced to make him complicit with the system. Instead, he used his position strategically, gathering information, building networks, and developing a political consciousness that was sophisticated and revolutionary. By his early 20s, Samuel had become a deacon in the Baptist church, a position that gave him legitimate reasons to travel between plantations, to gather groups of people for religious services, and to speak publicly in ways that were normally forbidden to enslaved people. The church became both his genuine spiritual home and his perfect cover for political organizing. What made Samuel extraordinary as a leader was his combination of moral vision, strategic intelligence, and communication skills that allowed him to articulate ideas in ways that resonated with both the educated and the illiterate, with both the deeply religious and the purely pragmatic. He understood that successful resistance required more than just courage or anger. It required a coherent philosophy that people could believe in, a practical strategy they could follow, and an organizational structure that could coordinate action across vast distances. Samuel spent nearly a decade, from his early 20s until 1831, building all three of these elements, creating an infrastructure of resistance that was hidden in plain sight, disguised as religious community but actually functioning as a revolutionary cell network. Samuel's core philosophical argument was both simple and profound. Enslaved people were human beings created by God with inherent dignity and rights. Slavery was a sin against God and humanity, and therefore enslaved people had not just the right, but the obligation to resist their bondage. He preached this message in coded language during church services, speaking about the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, about Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers, about the biblical command to love your neighbor as yourself, and what that meant for a system that treated human beings as property. People understood the subtext, understood that Samuel was not just teaching religion, but teaching resistance, providing both moral justification and spiritual courage for what would eventually need to be done. But Samuel was also a pragmatist who understood that moral arguments alone would not free anyone. He spent years studying the political and economic structures of slavery in Jamaica, understanding how the system functioned, where its vulnerabilities were, and what forms of resistance would be most effective. He learned that the British Parliament was debating the abolition of slavery, that there were factions in Britain who wanted to end the system, and that public opinion was slowly turning against slavery on moral grounds. He learned that the plantation economy depended entirely on the labor of enslaved people, that if that labor stopped, the entire system would collapse almost immediately. And he learned that the colonial authorities and plantation owners were far more afraid of coordinated resistance than of individual acts of rebellion, because coordination suggested organization, intelligence, and capability that contradicted everything the ideology of slavery claimed about black people. These insights led Samuel to develop a strategy that was sophisticated and carefully calibrated. Organize a massive work stoppage rather than a violent rebellion, demand wages for labor rather than immediate complete freedom, time the action to coincide with the Christmas holidays, when authorities and plantation owners would be less vigilant, and use the disruption to force negotiation rather than to destroy infrastructure. Samuel believed that if 60,000 enslaved people across western Jamaica simply refused to work and demanded to be paid as free laborers, the economic pressure would be so enormous that the plantation owners and colonial government would be forced to negotiate, and that negotiation could lead to the gradual end of slavery. It was a strategy based on nonviolent resistance, economic leverage, and political timing, and it showed a level of strategic sophistication that rivals any revolutionary movement in history. To organize 60,000 people across dozens of plantations required communication networks and organizational structures that were extraordinary in their complexity and their secrecy. Samuel built these over years, using the Baptist Church as his primary vehicle. He identified leaders on each plantation, people who were respected in their communities and who shared his vision, and he trained them systematically. He taught them how to communicate using coded language and symbols, how to pass messages through seemingly innocent interactions, how to build consensus within their communities without arousing suspicion from overseers and plantation owners. He created a system where each plantation cell was semi-autonomous but connected to others through trusted intermediaries, so that if one cell was discovered, it would not compromise the entire network. One of Samuel's key lieutenants was a man named Robert Gardner, who worked on a different plantation and who had his own network of contacts and influence. Robert was older than Samuel, in his 40s, and he brought a different set of skills. He was less interested in moral philosophy and more interested in practical tactics, in understanding how to actually execute a coordinated work stoppage, how to maintain discipline among thousands of people, how to respond to attempts by authorities to break the strike through intimidation or violence. Robert and Samuel complemented each other perfectly, with Samuel providing the vision and moral authority, while Robert provided the tactical planning and organizational discipline. Together they formed a leadership team that was more effective than either could have been alone. Another crucial figure was a woman named Dove, who worked as a domestic servant and who ran what Samuel called the intelligence network, gathering information from plantation houses across the region and passing it to the revolutionary leadership. Dove was in her 30s, had learned to read and write secretly, and had a mind that could retain vast amounts of detailed information without ever writing it down, which made her nearly impossible to catch because there was no physical evidence of her activities. She knew which plantation owners were most brutal and which were more lenient, which overseers were lazy and which were vigilant, what the colonial government was planning, what debates were happening in London about slavery, all of this information flowing through her and being distributed to Samuel and the other leaders so they could make informed decisions. By late 1831, Samuel judged that the time was right to act. He had learned through Dove's network that debates in the British Parliament about abolition were intensifying, that there were rumors enslaved people in Jamaica had already been granted freedom, but that colonial authorities were hiding this information and that the Christmas season was approaching when security would be at its lowest. He called a secret meeting of his core leadership team, about 50 people representing different plantations and different regions, and he presented his plan. On December 27th, immediately after Christmas, enslaved people across western Jamaica would simply refuse to return to work. They would not attack plantation owners, would not burn buildings initially, would not engage in violence unless attacked first. They would simply stop working and demand wages as free laborers. The economic impact would be immediate and devastating, and the colonial authorities would be forced to negotiate. The reaction to Samuel's plan was mixed among the leadership. Some, particularly younger members, wanted more aggressive action, wanted to seize plantations by force, wanted to physically overthrow the system rather than negotiate with it. Others, particularly older members who had seen previous rebellions crushed brutally, were afraid that even a non-violent work stoppage would be met with massive retaliation that would get thousands of people killed. Samuel listened to all perspectives and then made his argument. If we rise up with violence as our first resort, they will call us savages and crush us with the full power of the British military, and the world will believe they were justified. But if we simply stop working and demand to be treated as human beings deserving of wages, we occupy the moral high ground. We prove we are rational, organized, and capable of sophisticated political action. Even if they crush us eventually, we will have changed how the world sees us and how we see ourselves. That is worth the risk. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. They would proceed with Samuel's plan. The next weeks were spent in final preparations, with messages going out to cells across the region, with final instructions being given, with people preparing psychologically and spiritually for what was coming. Samuel spent this time preaching more openly than he ever had before, giving sermons that barely bothered with subtext, speaking directly about freedom, about dignity, about the obligation to resist injustice. He knew that once the strike began, his role as organizer would be exposed, and he was likely to be captured and executed. He made peace with that possibility, seeing his own potential martyrdom as part of the larger strategy. Understanding that sometimes leaders have to be willing to sacrifice themselves for the cause they serve. On December 27, 1831, the strike began exactly as planned. Across western Jamaica, on plantation after plantation, enslaved people simply did not show up for work. When overseers came to the quarters demanding they return to the fields, they were met with calm refusal. "We will not work as slaves anymore. We want to be paid for our labor. We are willing to work, but we will be paid as free people." The initial reaction of plantation owners and overseers was confusion and then rage. They threatened, they cajoled, they tried to force people back to work through intimidation. But the discipline held. 60,000 people coordinated across dozens of plantations, standing firm in their refusal to work without wages. It was extraordinary, unprecedented, and it sent shockwaves through the entire colonial system. The colonial authorities reacted swiftly and brutally. The governor declared martial law, called out the militia, and demanded that enslaved people return to work immediately or face severe consequences. When these demands were met with continued refusal, the authorities began arresting people they suspected of being leaders, but the cellular structure of the organization meant that removing one leader did not collapse the network. New leaders emerged, the strike continued, and the economic impact began to be felt as sugarcane sat unharvested and plantations ground to a halt. For the first week, Samuel's strategy of non-violent resistance held. But then something happened that Samuel had feared but could not prevent. Some groups, frustrated by the authorities' refusal to negotiate and angered by arrests and violence against strikers, began to retaliate by setting fire to plantation buildings and sugar works. Once the first fires were set, the character of the uprising changed. What had been a coordinated work stoppage with clear political demands became, in the eyes of the authorities, a violent rebellion that needed to be crushed with maximum force. Samuel tried to maintain discipline, sent out messages urging people to return to non-violent tactics, but the decentralized structure that had been a strength in organizing the strike now became a weakness in controlling its evolution. Different groups made different decisions, some maintaining discipline, others embracing more aggressive tactics, and the colonial authorities used the violence to justify massive military response. British regular troops were deployed alongside local militia, and they began systematically attacking enslaved people's communities, burning their homes, killing people indiscriminately, and creating a level of terror designed to break the rebellion through sheer, overwhelming force. The rebellion that would become known as the Baptist War, or the Christmas Rebellion, lasted approximately 2 weeks before it was finally suppressed. During that time, hundreds of plantations were affected, millions of pounds of property damage occurred, and the colonial economy was brought to its knees. But the human cost was devastating. Approximately 200 enslaved people were killed during the rebellion itself, and more than 300 were executed afterward in trials that were perfunctory at best. Samuel Sharpe was captured on January 6, 1832, found hiding in a cave in the mountains where he had been continuing to coordinate resistance, even as the rebellion was being crushed around him. When the soldiers found him, he was reportedly still writing messages to other leaders, still trying to organize, still believing that somehow they could salvage something from the chaos. Samuel was imprisoned in Montego Bay and subjected to a trial that lasted less than a day. The verdict was predetermined: guilty of fomenting rebellion, with the sentence being death by hanging. During the trial, Samuel was given the opportunity to speak, and he used it to deliver what witnesses described as one of the most powerful speeches they had ever heard. He spoke for over an hour without notes, articulating with precision and passion why he had organized the rebellion, what moral and political principles had guided him, and what he hoped would result from it, even in failure. "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery," he said. "I organized this uprising not out of hatred, but out of love. Love for my people who deserve to be free. Love for the children who should not have to grow up as property. Love even for those who enslaved us, because slavery destroys the humanity of the enslaver as well as the enslaved. I do not regret what I have done. I regret only that we did not achieve the full freedom we sought. But we have proven something important: that enslaved people are capable of sophisticated organization, of political thought, of moral vision. We have proven our humanity through our actions. That cannot be undone." On May 23, 1832, Samuel Sharpe was hanged in the central square of Montego Bay before a crowd of thousands, both white colonists who came to witness the execution of the rebellion's leader and enslaved people who came to mourn a man they saw as a prophet and a hero. As he stood on the gallows, Samuel spoke his final words, which were recorded by several witnesses. "I die for the cause of freedom. I have fought against slavery because it is evil, and I do not regret my actions. I pray that my death will not be in vain, that it will contribute in some way to the eventual freedom of my people. I die at peace with God and with myself." Then he was executed, his body left hanging for hours as a warning to others, and eventually buried in an unmarked grave because the colonial authorities feared his burial site would become a place of pilgrimage and resistance. But the colonial authorities could not control what Samuel's rebellion had unleashed. The uprising had been crushed militarily, but it had won politically and morally in ways that would become clear in the following years. The sheer scale of the rebellion, the fact that 60,000 people had coordinated action across an entire region, the sophistication of the organization, and Samuel's moral arguments all combined to shift public opinion in Britain dramatically against slavery. Abolitionist groups used the rebellion as evidence that slavery was not the benign institution its defenders claimed, that it created conditions of such injustice that massive resistance was inevitable, and that attempting to maintain slavery required levels of violence and repression that were morally indefensible. The economic disruption of the rebellion also demonstrated that slavery was not as stable or profitable as plantation owners claimed, that it depended on the compliance of enslaved people, and that compliance could not be guaranteed through force alone. Within 18 months of Samuel's execution, in August 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which mandated the gradual emancipation of all enslaved people in British colonies, including Jamaica. The act would take effect in stages over several years, with final full emancipation coming in 1838. But the decision to abolish slavery had been made, and it was directly influenced by the rebellion Samuel had led. Historians debate exactly how much credit the Baptist War deserves for the timing of abolition, as there were many factors at play, including the broader abolitionist movement in Britain. But there is consensus that the rebellion accelerated the process significantly and made it politically impossible for Parliament to continue ignoring the slavery question. In this sense, Samuel Sharpe achieved his goal even in death. He forced the system to confront the fact that slavery was unsustainable and unjust, and he contributed to its eventual end. The legacy of Samuel Sharpe in Jamaica and in the broader history of resistance to slavery is profound. He became a national hero, honored with monuments, with his image on Jamaican currency, with schools and institutions named after him. His strategic approach to resistance, his emphasis on organization and moral vision, and his willingness to sacrifice himself for the cause influenced subsequent leaders and movements. But beyond the official recognition, Samuel's legacy lives in the collective memory of resistance, in the understanding that freedom is not granted but claimed, that organizing is as important as courage, that strategy and moral vision must work together, and that sometimes the most powerful act is to simply refuse to continue participating in your own oppression. What can we learn from Samuel Sharpe's life and the rebellion he led? We learn first that intelligence and education are powerful tools of resistance, that Samuel's ability to read and his understanding of politics and economics were as important to the rebellion as any physical action. We learn that successful resistance requires long-term organizing and patience, that Samuel spent nearly a decade building the networks and structures necessary for coordinated action. We learn that moral vision is essential, that people need to believe their cause is just and their actions are right, and that Samuel provided that moral framework through his religious leadership and his articulation of human dignity. We learn that strategy matters enormously, that Samuel's decision to pursue a work stoppage rather than immediate violent uprising was based on careful analysis of what would be most effective and most likely to generate sympathy from potential allies. And we learn that leaders must be willing to sacrifice themselves, that Samuel understood he was likely signing his own death warrant when he organized the rebellion, but did it anyway because the cause was larger than his individual life. We also learn about the complexity of resistance movements and how they can evolve in ways their leaders do not fully control. Samuel wanted non-violent resistance, but the rebellion became violent anyway, because he could not control every action of 60,000 people across dozens of plantations, each responding to local circumstances and provocations. This does not invalidate his strategy or his leadership, but it does remind us that mass movements are inherently difficult to direct precisely, that they take on lives of their own, and that leaders must be prepared for that reality. Samuel adapted as best he could, continued leading even as the situation evolved beyond his initial plan, and never abandoned his followers even when he could have saved himself by fleeing. The story of Samuel Sharpe also forces us to confront difficult questions about violence and resistance. Was he right to encourage tens of thousands of people to engage in action that he knew would likely result in brutal retaliation? Should he have pursued different tactics that might have been safer, even if less effective? These questions do not have simple answers, and Samuel himself wrestled with them throughout the planning and execution of the rebellion. But what is clear is that he acted from deep moral conviction, that he believed the cause of freedom was worth the risks, and that he never asked others to sacrifice what he was not willing to sacrifice himself. Whether we judge his specific tactical decisions as wise or not, we can recognize the courage and moral seriousness with which he approached the impossible situation of trying to resist an unjust system that had overwhelming force on its side. It is also important to understand Samuel Sharpe's rebellion within the broader context of resistance to slavery across the Americas. The Baptist War was not an isolated event, but part of a long history of slave rebellions, revolts, and uprisings that spanned 3 centuries and took place in virtually every location where slavery existed. From the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, to the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804, to Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia in 1800, to the German Coast Uprising in Louisiana in 1811, to Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831, occurring the same year as Samuel's Rebellion. Enslaved people consistently and repeatedly rose up against their bondage. Each rebellion had its own character and circumstances, but together they demonstrate that enslaved people never accepted slavery as natural or inevitable, that they constantly sought freedom, and that they were willing to risk everything to achieve it. What distinguishes Samuel's rebellion from many others is its scale, its level of organization, and its strategic sophistication. Most slave rebellions involved hundreds or at most a few thousand people and were relatively short-lived before being crushed. The Baptist War involved 60,000 people, lasted 2 weeks, and required years of planning and organization. Samuel's achievement in coordinating action across such a large population with limited communication technology and under constant surveillance from authorities who would have killed him if they discovered what he was planning is extraordinary and speaks to both his personal capabilities and the strength of the community networks he built. The rebellion proved that enslaved people were capable of anything free people were capable of, that the only thing preventing them from achieving freedom was the overwhelming force arrayed against them, not any deficiency in their intelligence, courage, or organizational ability. The memory of Samuel Sharpe was preserved and celebrated by the communities he had led and served. In the years after emancipation, as formerly enslaved people built free communities, established churches and schools, and created new institutions, they told stories about Samuel, kept his memory alive, and used his example to teach subsequent generations about the importance of fighting for freedom and dignity. These stories were not just historical remembrance, but active engagement with the meaning and implications of his life. Conversations about what kind of resistance was appropriate in different circumstances, about how to balance moral vision with practical necessity, about the costs and benefits of different strategies. Samuel became not just a historical figure, but a living presence in community discourse about justice and freedom. As we conclude this story, think about Samuel Sharpe standing in a church on Christmas Day, 1831. Addressing a crowd of people who were terrified and hopeful in equal measure, telling them that they would no longer work as slaves, that they would demand their dignity, and that whatever happened, they would prove their humanity through their actions. Think about the years of preparation that led to that moment, the thousands of quiet conversations in quarters and fields and churches, the networks built through trust and shared vision, the coded messages passed through songs and sermons. Think about the 60,000 people who heard the call and responded, who stepped forward despite knowing the risks, who stood together in the most powerful form of resistance possible, the simple refusal to participate in their own oppression. Think about Samuel in the mountains after the rebellion had turned violent, still writing messages, still organizing, still believing that somehow good would come from the chaos. Think about him on the gallows, declaring he would rather die free than live enslaved, speaking truth in his final moments, refusing to be broken even in death. Samuel Sharpe's life and death remind us that freedom is never free, that it requires sacrifice, that it demands courage not just from individuals, but from entire communities, and that sometimes the price is paid in blood and lives, but the cost of not fighting is the loss of human dignity, which is ultimately more valuable than physical survival. His story reminds us that intelligence and moral vision are forms of power that can challenge even the most overwhelming systems of oppression, that organizing and strategy are as important as courage, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply assert your own humanity and demand that others recognize it. His legacy lives on, not just in monuments and official recognition, but in every movement that fights for justice, in every person who refuses to accept oppression, in every community that organizes collectively to claim rights that should have been theirs from birth. Samuel Sharpe proved that enslaved people were not victims waiting to be saved, but agents of their own liberation, that they had the intelligence to strategize, the courage to act, and the moral vision to inspire others. That truth, once proven, could never be erased, no matter how brutally the rebellion was crushed or how many people were executed in its aftermath. The system killed Samuel Sharpe, but it could not kill what he represented or what he had proven. And in the end, that was more powerful than all the armies and laws arrayed against him.